Hello, I'm glad to present this special interview with the Foreign Minister of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Mr. Mohammad Zarif. Welcome to Telesur.
Good to be with you.
You have just met President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. What was the atmosphere of this conversation? What topics did you talk about? And how do you assess the bilateral ties between Iran and Venezuela so far?
We have excellent relations between Iran and Venezuela. And the meeting with President Maduro was very friendly. He was very gracious to receive me at his home. We had a good conversation about how to further enhance bilateral relations in the area of energy, science and technology, COVID-19, where Venezuela has made significant progress and Iran has made significant progress, and we can share.
By the way, how's the situation of the COVID-19 pandemic in Iran nowadays?
Well, it's not that good because of the huge impact of the virus on the Iranian society very early on, and the fact that less than perfect adherence to social distancing, to health protocols is being observed in Iran. So we have too high a number of casualties, but we have made significant advances in producing a vaccine, significant advances in trying to find a remedy. We understand that Venezuela is also making progress in these areas. So we can.
How have you observed the way the Venezuelan government is dealing with the pandemic?
Well, I see the public respect for the protocols, the health protocols, to be excellent here.
The so-called 7+7 method.
7+7 method is an interesting method. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to impose a quarantine in Iran because of the necessity for our population to continue to work. The population is not ready to have a lockdown, so we have a different situation. But we thought that the 7+7 idea was an interesting innovation here. So we did talk about all of these, and plus we talked about the international situation, the need for countries that are being pressured by the United States to come together to insist on respect for the rule of law, Charter of the United Nations, and to cooperate with each other in defeating these illegal sanctions.
Before we go further on those topics, I would like to ask you, after the sabotage attack denounced by President Maduro at the Venezuelan main oil refinery, I wonder if Iran isn't afraid of the risk that the collaboration in oil industry could carry to your country. I mean, will this bilateral collaboration go even further?
It will, of course, go further. We have survived over 40 years of this type of pressure by the United States, and if we wanted to give up, we would have given up a long time ago.
Okay. On the United States, Elliot Abrams, the U.S. State Department Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela, has said, and quote, "The transfer of long-range missiles from Iran to Venezuela is not acceptable to the United States and will not be tolerated or permitted." A, is it true that the Venezuelan government has been buying weapons to Iran? And B, what do you think about the threat made by the U.S. administration to Iran and Venezuela?
Well, it is totally legitimate for Iran and Venezuela to have defense cooperation. The United States tried to prevent that in the Security Council, and it failed. It failed drastically by 13-2, and that is why the United States is resorting to its old strategy of basically threatening and bullying countries. Iran and Venezuela have not allowed themselves to be bullied by the United States, and I think this will continue to be the case. Our cooperation is quite legitimate. We will continue to cooperate with Venezuela in areas that...
Even in the military area?
Even in the defense area, and we believe that it is the right of Venezuela to purchase military equipment from any place they want. But what Venezuela needs and what Iran has to offer are things that will be discussed between our defense officials and will continue to be a subject of our bilateral relations.
So
I think that's none of the United States' business.
So Iran is not afraid of virtual new sanctions from the White House?
Well, basically, as Michael O'Brien, the National Security Advisor to President Trump, has said, there are no sanctions left for the United States to impose on Iran. So they have basically out-sanctioned themselves.
You have recently said, and I quote, "It's not what new U.S. administration says during campaign that counts, but what it does in office." What would be the U.S. foreign policy after this election? Is there a difference between Democrats and Republicans in office? What do you think of it?
We don't know who will be in the White House yet after this election. But there are obvious differences between these two camps, particularly during the Trump administration. There is even a divergence within the Republican Party about the type of diplomacy that President Trump has been pursuing or not pursuing, basically, because we haven't seen much diplomacy during President Trump. We've seen a lot of threats by him and by his Secretary of State. So there will be differences, but what is important for us is not the tone or the rhetoric, but the actions. The United States has engaged in illegal activity against Iran, has hurt our economy, has hurt our people, and it has to change its practice if it wants the situation to change.
Do you have any hope that the United States will return to the nuclear deal with Iran?
Well, the nuclear deal is not a revolving door. The United States decided to leave that deal. Now, if it wants to come back, it has to gain a seat at the negotiating table. But what is important is that the United States did not have the right to leave the deal, because it is not just a bilateral deal between Iran and the United States, it's a part of a Security Council resolution. So if the United States wanted to be basically free from the obligations in that resolution, it should have withdrawn from the United Nations, not just from a deal.
Iran has recently won a victory at the Security Council of the United Nations. How do you receive that?
Well, we defeated the United States 3 times in the Security Council in the last few months, and that shows how isolated U.S. policy of maximum pressure and U.S. bullying has become in the international community. It's not a victory for Iran, but it's a victory for international law, for the United Nations Charter, and for United Nations Security Council resolutions.
In early January, when General Qasem Soleimani was murdered by the U.S. forces in Iraq, responding, by the way, to President Donald Trump's orders, Iran promised to revenge. I wonder what kind of revenge has the Iranian government already accomplished its promise or not yet?
Well, we took proportionate military action against a terrorist operation by the United States, targeting the base from which the military attack against, the terrorist attack against General Soleimani was conducted. But the fact of the matter is the United States committed a grave crime, and the consequences of that grave crime, particularly the public consequences and the impact on the feeling of the people of Iran and Iraq, as you saw in the processions, the funeral processions of General Soleimani in both countries as well as elsewhere in the Middle East, will continue to haunt the United States. One of the consequences has been that the Iraqi parliament asked the United States to leave Iraq, and I believe that's the ultimate price that the United States will have to pay for its adventurism and its aggression and terrorism in Iraq against General Soleimani.
Will the U.S. troops quit the Middle East someday? What do you think of Trump's announcements on that? Will he deliver on what he promised before leaving the White House, if he leaves the White House? Or are his promises nothing more than mere propaganda?
Well, mostly it's propaganda. And he's been very clear that in places that they are present, they're present not to protect people, not even to protect American interests, but to protect oil. That's what he has said about Syria, that they are there simply to guard the oil fields and to take advantage, that is to steal the wealth of the Syrian people.
That's the right verb, to steal.
Yeah, that's the right word, because they are not authorized to be there. They've never been asked to send forces to Syria. So they're there illegally, they're occupying parts of Syria, and they're stealing their wealth.
Okay, I remember that President Hassan Rouhani at the UN General Assembly in September 2019 invited all the countries directly affected by the developments by the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz to the Coalition of Hope, meaning Hormuz Peace Endeavor. Is that peace coalition currently possible, taking into consideration the recent restoration of bilateral ties between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and the State of Israel, taking into consideration also the historical ties between Saudi Arabia and the United States of America, taking into consideration the recent discovery of an Israeli secret embassy in Manama, and last but not least, taking into consideration the remaining American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Well, the policies that you just mentioned are all wrong policies and harmful policies that harm the region, harm the Palestinian cause, and harm, first and foremost, the population of the countries that you just mentioned. But the fact of the matter is you don't choose your neighbors. These countries, countries in the southern Persian Gulf, are our neighbors, and we have a policy of maintaining friendly relations with our neighbors. So the offer is on the table. If they choose to use that offer, they're welcome to do so. There are requirements on all sides, and we are prepared to do our part, and we expect them to do theirs.
On the very recent attacks in France and other European countries, President Macron has said that they have been a consequence of the so-called Islamist terrorism. What do you think of his accusations? And what do you think of the way Europe deals with these violent attacks?
Islam has nothing to do with terrorism, and the concept Islamic terrorism is a forgery, and it's not becoming for the president of a civilized country to use a forged name. But we condemn terrorism, we condemn extremism. But don't forget that these extremists that are conducting these terrorist operations are sponsored by US and Western allies in the region, most prominently Saudi Arabia. The ideology that they espouse is basically promoted by Saudi Arabia, has been for a long time. So it's hypocritical to condemn Muslims for something that Western allies are doing. I believe desecration of values is an act of violence. It doesn't justify a violent response. But we should not forget that the act of violence through desecration, through insults, is directed against the entire 1.9 billion population in the Muslim world.
Is the French state adopting a correct position on what France thinks is the freedom of speech and expression?
Well, obviously, it's hypocritical to call attacks on others freedom of speech while you do not even allow certain issues to be discussed in public. Freedom of expression when you do not allow Muslims to wear Islamic hijab in schools in France, that's an expression. Why don't you allow that? And you allow somebody to harm the feelings of millions and billions of Muslims, both in France and elsewhere in the world.
Correct. What is the Iranian point of view on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? How could the conflict affect the stability of Iran?
Well, it is happening at our border, basically. That's the site of the violence. We have been very clear that occupation of territory is not permitted. Change of international boundaries is unacceptable. And territories of Azerbaijan that have been occupied must be evacuated and liberated. At the same time, we are concerned first about human casualties, about civilian casualties, also about the fact that extremist organizations have been brought to the site of conflict to act as mercenaries on the battleground, and that's a threat not only to Iran but to the entire regional peace and security. So we believe that that has to end, but occupation also has to end.
Would the Iranian government be willing to mediate in this conflict?
Well, I asked my deputy to go to both Azerbaijan and Armenia, as well as to Russia and Turkey, and offer our proposal for mediation. Now, our proposal, which is a rather detailed proposal about what needs to be done, is on the table. It's being considered by the two parties, plus the neighbors in Turkey and Russia, and we will wait for their response.
Okay. So, how does the Iranian government bet on multipolarity? How does Iran conceive the new geopolitics according to the current facts worldwide?
Well, we believe that the new international order has not been formed yet, but it certainly will not be a unipolar world, and it certainly will not be a Western world. It's a post-Western world. I don't know about the polarity in this post-Western world. It may be multipolar or it may be non-polar. We will see, because now the players in the international community are much wider than the community of states. Individuals, groups, non-state actors, corporations have become actors in the global scene. So we will have to wait and see how this new global order develops.
Speaking on the community of states, what is your opinion on the current leadership of multilateral organizations? What is missing from that leadership? The United Nations, the Security Council, for instance?
Well, I believe it is important for international organizations to be truly multilateral and not impacted and affected by the policies of a unilateralist government. Unfortunately, the United States has an undue influence in many international organizations, while the policy of the United States is only to take advantage of these international organizations to the extent of its interest. We just saw in the Security Council how the United States tried to abuse the Security Council in a rather absurd fashion in order to advance its illegitimate interest against Iran, and how it was rebuffed by 13 members of the Security Council. So these are the realities, and I think particularly the Secretariat of these international organizations must be vigilant to avoid being abused and misused by the United States.
During this visit to the region, you also have Cuba on the agenda. How have the bilateral ties between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Caribbean island? Is there any new agreement to sign in Havana?
Well, we have excellent relations with Cuba. We've had excellent relations with Cuba since the revolution. We both suffer from the wrongful policies and practices of the United States, and we have naturally developed very close cooperation in various fields, from science and technology and biotechnology to energy and other areas of cooperation. I will go and discuss with them both political issues as well as further economic cooperation between Iran and Cuba. And then after Cuba, I'm glad that I'm going to participate in the inauguration of the democratically elected president of Bolivia.
So, by the way, how have been the ties between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Bolivia? I mean, the new Bolivia with the recently elected president Luis Arce, and before with President Evo Morales.
Well, we had extremely good relations with President Evo Morales, and we look forward to having very good relations with the new democratically elected government of Bolivia. Unfortunately, we did not have very positive relations with the government that took away the votes of the people.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.
Well, this has been a special interview with the Foreign Minister of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Mr. Mohammad Zarif. Thank you very much.